Amat merat ike tesolderat igmerut.
Hey all, Dave here. Welcome to the penultimate part in this series of videos. In this part, we'll be answering questions 41 to 50 of the Enlightio 56 questions for atheists list. I haven't looked at these questions ahead of time, so I'll be going in blind. I suppose to some extent I have an added advantage of this being scripted, so I do have that little extra time to formulate my responses, so the responses aren't quite as off the cuff as they would be if this was a live stream. But I generally do just typing out the responses as I would have if it was a live stream. I generally type out the responses if I'm responding to it live, but it's much easier for my attention deficit filled brain to read off of a script than it is to respond live. Plus, it's better for everyone else as they don't have to put up with as many pauses while I think and on, and go off on various little tangents. Anyway, that's enough of that. Let's get on with it. Question 41. What do you think is the most convincing evidence against atheism? So this question could be reframed as, what do you think is the most convincing evidence for theism? As evidence against atheism would simply be evidence in favor of theism in some flavor. And I think I'm going to have to answer a slightly different question to this one, as I don't really find any of the evidence particularly convincing, but there is some I do find interesting. So I think the question I'll have to answer here instead is, what do you think is the most interesting evidence for theism? Many atheists will obviously disagree with me here, and I'll probably have my atheist card revoked and be accused of being a crypto-theist again. But it is what it is. The first bit of evidence I find interesting and in favor of theism is a pretty simple one. That evidence is the apparent design that we see in nature. I've mentioned this one before in the past, but this is one of the major ones for me. Yes, I know that there are many good responses to this, and we have an understanding of how the universe and life could be formed naturally. However, the idea of design can always be pushed further and further back, and questions of why it works the way it does can always be brought up. I get that many atheists are happy to just dismiss these ideas outright, and I'm not here to argue that you have to take design seriously. I just find the intuition of design to be a reasonably powerful one, even if it is one that can be overcome by other data and arguments. Another one is simply the vast gulf between ourselves and other species on the planet, at least when it comes to our ability to reason and communicate and things like morality and levels of consciousness and our ability to adapt to our environment and things like that. Well, there are many animals with many other different abilities and traits that far outweigh ours in areas like sight, speed, hearing, and the like. There is still a vast gulf in our mental capacities compared to other species, which to me is pretty interesting. I can see how they can come about from evolution, but I can also see the difficulty in explaining some of it, and think that it can be used to make an interesting case for God. And finally, simply the idea of how the universe could come about from an infinite past raises some interesting questions for me. The idea of a timeless God is no more coherent to me than the idea of a timeless universe, and I don't find the idea of a timeless God as something that answers the problem of an infinite past. But I do find the idea of how the universe got here an interesting one. Yes, I know there's the whole it's always existed, but there's a little bit more than that to me. But I do find the idea of the beginning of the universe an interesting one, and one that leaves open the question of some being that may be responsible. Again, I'm not convinced that it could be a god, but the option is something that is there in that space. I don't really find many of the other arguments interesting, and I don't find any of them particularly convincing, especially not when it comes to religions like Christianity and Islam. However, for a bog standard form of theism, I think these are the three that I find most interesting, and the three that I find myself often pondering. Question 42. What do you think about the problem of evil? I think the problem of evil is one of those things that you will either find compelling or not. For me, it is a pretty compelling argument against the conception of God as is often put forward by many Christians that I meet. I don't find any of the theodicy arguments convincing, let alone compelling. At least not any that I've heard anyway. Arguments like soul building and the best of all possible worlds are arguments that I find pretty weak. I can see how they might have some argumentative power for those that believe though, just as I can see how the problem of evil arguments have some argumentative power for those that disbelieve. When it comes to belief or disbelief in God, I think they come about in far more complex ways than simple arguments for and against the existence of God. As I've stated many times in the past, cumulative cases are usually where the compelling force is as far as arguments for and against God. The version of theism being spoken about plays a part, and I also think that our past experiences, our psychology, our desires, our worldviews, how we desire to be seen, and much, much more can all play a part. Like I say though, I find the various problem of evil arguments to be pretty compelling arguments against the existence of the kind of God they're meant to be arguing against, and theodicy's insufficient to overcome those arguments. Question 43. What do you think about the idea of a secular society? It really depends on what you mean by secular society here. That's something of a vague term. But if secular society here is being defined as something similar to a government that does not favor any religion or non-religion and has no particular religion in power making the laws, then I'm all for and in favor of something like that. It would obviously be impossible to remove all religious influence from the government, at least not without discriminating against religious people. Something that a secular society really shouldn't be doing, just as it shouldn't be discriminating against non-religious people. But a society that attempts to be as fair as possible to all people of all religious and non-religious views is something that I support. Again though, the idea of secularism is a huge and complex one, and there are lots of ideas about how that should look. Question 44. Do you think religion is harmful to society? Why or why not? This question is a little more specific than the previous question I answered, but I did answer this when I answered question 18. So if you want to see my answer to this, then there will be a link to the specific video in the series in the description. Question 45. What do you think is the most important thing to teach children about atheism? It really depends on what you mean by children here, because I think age makes a difference. For very young children, I'm not really sure that there's anything important to teach them about atheism. I guess maybe it's important to teach them about atheists and how there's nothing scary or wrong with people just because they're atheists. But most little kids won't really know any difference about something like that. I think it's more important to teach teenagers about atheism. And I think the most important thing to teach them is that there is nothing wrong with doubting the existence of God, or believing that God doesn't exist, or doubting the truth of religion. It's important to teach them that there's nothing wrong with them for having these doubts or having these beliefs. I actually think it's far more important to teach certain adults about this, if I'm honest. Question 46. How do you deal with the feeling of being alone in your beliefs without a community of like-minded people to support you? I don't actually feel alone in my beliefs, or without a community of like-minded people to support me. There are many other things besides atheism that defines me, and I have found myself being part of a community in those regards. Things like music, discussing film, discussing philosophy, and more. I've always also felt a part of my local community, and I'm lucky enough to have great neighbors and others in the local vicinity who have always been very friendly and always taken the time to chat with me. With the advent of social media as well, that has also expanded the idea of community. While many atheists argue against the idea of an atheist community, I'm not so opposed to that, and I find myself as part of a greater atheist community. There is always a way to find community of like-minded people to support us, regardless of what it is we're talking about. There will always be assholes out there that are part of that community, but the average member of most communities are usually pretty good and pretty supportive people. Question 47. What do you think are the most pressing ethical issues facing humanity today? Okay, well, this is a huge question. I mean, where do you even begin with something like this? The world is a big place with many local and international ethical issues. In order to keep this short, I'm not going to argue for each one, I'm just going to list a bunch. So these are what I think are some of the most pressing issues. Poverty, discrimination, access to healthcare and education, war, child abuse, workers' rights, issues with power, factory farming, and more. This is such a large topic, and without writing a dissertation on the topic and essays on each part, it isn't really something I can do justice to, and definitely not something I can do justice to in a video like this. Question 48. Do you think atheists should actively advocate for atheism? Yep, they most definitely should. There are many great arguments for atheism and many great reasons for accepting atheism. Question 49. What do you think are the main obstacles to atheism being more widely accepted? I think tradition is a huge one. Various forms of monotheism have been the main players for a very long time and run through the fabric of most societies. The beliefs are passed down from generation to generation and form a major part of many communities. These are taught generationally, and the idea is reinforced through the community and the family. The mystery of life is another one. There are many mysteries left to be solved about the human experience and about the universe, and theism offers some pretty good explanations for them. Explanations that go beyond the physics as well. Forms of theism offer values and hope and give some semblance of meaning in what is essentially a meaningless universe. The fact that various forms of theism can offer this meaning and hope is a pretty powerful thing in favor of theism. And there would need to be things to replace these within atheism. Theism also offers community, where many atheists argue that there should be no such thing as an atheist community. Religion and belief in God offers many things that atheism simply doesn't. Not that it can't, but it simply doesn't at the moment. So to some degree, I would also argue that many atheists are one of the main obstacles to atheism becoming more widely accepted. Question 50. Do you think that atheism will eventually become the dominant worldview? Who knows? Maybe one day, I guess, but that day is a long, long, long way from now. Okay, so that's the penultimate video in this series done. There are only 6 questions left from this, so the next video will be much shorter. Lucky you, you don't have to listen to me for quite as long in the next one. I'll start looking for some more lists like this, as I have to admit, I've kind of enjoyed doing this little series. There's been some interesting questions in this one, and questions that are very different to the norm that I find as far as questions for atheist lists go. I also have some ideas for some upcoming videos based off of some of the questions in this list. If there's any questions in particular you want me to focus on from this list, then feel free to drop me a comment. Or if you have any suggestions for topics or any videos you come across recently that you'd like me to respond to, then feel free to leave me a comment about them too. Take care all, and I'll see you soon hopefully. Until the next time, I hope life treats you well. Bye.